Hi, my name is Lars-Erik Lundin, and I'm now developing yet another podcast, coming back to a topic which I dealt with a lot a couple of years ago, before I started the inquiry on the nuclear ban treaty. I wrote a book in 2015 about the EU and security, and I worked a lot on staff training in the EU on the way forward for the European Common Foreign and Security Policy, and in particular on the, of course, European security and defense policy, where I have been active over more than 15 years in the European Commission and later as EU ambassador in the EU External Action Service after the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty in 2009-2010. What is important to note here that there have been two strategies underpinning EU action during these 2 decades. The first one in 2003 on the European Security Strategy, which was drafted in more promising times, where essentially the tone of the strategy was optimistic and mainly focus on the intergovernmental side of European Union action, the one which is supported by consensus decisions among member states. The European Union Global Strategy, which after a long hesitation among member states was promulgated in 2015, is another, a more differentiated strategy, more, in a sense, more realistic, focusing on the need to get the EU action together, working both with what member states can bring to the table and what is invested into the common European structures, including funding on the community side. It took a long time before member states could agree and to accept such an approach, but it has turned out to be extremely necessary, of course, in the last years, as we have seen with migration, with Ukraine, with all the different challenges that have faced the European Union. And against this background, it's perhaps useful for those who are not so automatically inclined to go through large documents in the EU websites to have a look together with me on the review of the European Union Global Strategy 3 years on, looking forward, which has just been published after the Foreign Affairs meeting the other day in Brussels. By the External Action Service. It is sort of a testament from the High Representative and Vice President of the Commission, Federica Mogherini, after her work for 5 years, as she is now soon leaving her post. But it's also a forward-looking document. It may seem, particularly in the summary, as somewhat self-congratulatory, but as one can clearly see when you go through the around 50 pages of the document, there is a lot of substance in it. And it is useful also for individual EU member states looking at their situation, not least in view of the situation with the United States at present, the uncertainties in the cooperative framework with the US, in view of the challenges from both Russia and China, and in view of Brexit, to see what can the European Union bring to the table in support of national security strategies of individual EU member states, including Sweden, my own country, which is now in the coming years going to look at, of course, how the current national security strategy of Sweden should be updated. It is a document from 2017, and we are in the Royal Swedish Academy of War Sciences currently engaged in developing our view on this from a security policy perspective, focusing both on civil defense, military defense, but also wider foreign policy and security policy action. So this podcast is developed in two versions. One is the one where you can listen to the whole thing, and I will just try to speak in a way which doesn't assume that you have the document in front of you. But there is also a YouTube version of the document, of the podcast, which gives you a more direct illustration to what I'm talking about. I will use three colors on the screen illustrating what I'm talking about. The green color will illustrate what has already been done. The blue color will illustrate what is proposed to be done in the coming period as new leaders come to the office, including a new president of the European Commission, a new president of the Council, a new High Representative. This podcast is being recorded in June 2019, so this is just before the taking of office of the new European Parliament as well, I think on the 2nd of July. Looking at this document, it is striking that there are some quite important concepts which need to be kept in mind, which have developed gradually over the last years, and which are now firmly incorporated into the new document. And I will scroll the document through so that you can follow it, and you don't have to read for it yourself. You can perhaps get a quick understanding of what the document is all about and more concrete understanding of its content. So this is a 3-year report. It's a document, of course, which was promulgated in 2015, but which was followed up with a number of specific action plans in different areas. The key word here was the ever more connected and contested and complex world. That was the situation that the EU was facing in 2014-15 as this was promulgated, focusing on the security of the Union, global governance, resilience, which is a very important concept in the strategy, which has its importance, for instance, in the context of migration. The idea being that partner countries to the EU, particularly to the south, should have a chance to manage their own situation without leading to enormous migration to the neighboring countries and to the EU. The integrated approach was previously the notion of the comprehensive approach, which means that there will be a number of linked up approaches bringing together internal and external security, etc. So the idea is it should be a credible, responsive and joined up union. Then there is an annex which I recommend to read because it contains a number of important tables which gives you a brief summary of what has been done in practice in the various areas. There is a foreword noting that this is not a theoretical exercise. See the European Union as a global point of reference, focusing on the European Union security and defense policy, but also on common industrial and research projects. Previously, this kind of strategy would not be able to include what was done through the Commission. Clearly, the resources and services of the European Commission have been fully integrated into the strategy, and I would say that after 5 years there is a completely different view of what the European Commission should and could do in the context of security and defense than was the case when I was active until 2011. There is this continued focus on multilateralism and partners And there is a stress that this is not just an issue of soft power, which is traditionally associated with the EU. Again, focus on multilateralism, and then working again on the issue of financial instruments, a concrete context where you work, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan. And there are some recommendations, although of course not so many in the document. One can expect that any new High Representative or President of the Commission or President of the Council will come up with their own suggestions for the way ahead. And typically this is done in also certainly in a certain way, a more critical approach, a critical response than you can do having worked with the issue for 5 years. The point of departure, as I said, was a connected, contested and complex world with a fragmented distribution of power, problems related to non-proliferation and arms control, of course, backdrop, financial crisis 2008-2009, transnational challenges, climate, demography, getting older in Europe, digitalization, which needs multilateral action supporting sustainable development. The global strategy was promulgated almost immediately after the Brexit vote was made in the UK, setting the stage for withdrawal of the UK from the European Union. From Sweden, it's interesting to note that the two persons sitting to the left on the picture here are, of course, the Swedish Foreign Minister and Swedish Defense Minister. It's an interesting picture because it shows that there is a unity of action affecting individual member states. So, a shared agenda focusing on 5 priorities: security of the Union, resilience to the east and south, and as we will see, it's mainly to the south. The focus is mainly to the south in this strategy. Dealing with conflicts and crises, cooperative regional orders and global governance. So the idea is again credible, responsive and joined up union. There is a progress recorded, turning the strategy's vision into concrete action, European security and defense, the Western Balkans perspective, the nuclear deal with Iran, although we can clearly see that that is under very heavy attack, the step change in partnership with Africa, proposals have been made to scale up financial resources. There is a lot of work on communication, including disinformation, and the notion of autonomous action, although still in cooperation with partners, is a very central one in the strategy, not least on the defense side. And it's all based upon a development over the last 5 years, not least after Brexit, showing that Europeans in general support the EU perhaps even more than before, particularly, as I mentioned, after Brexit. Looking at the security of the Union, which was the first priority of the strategy, there was the definition of what is called a new level of ambition, 3 overarching objectives: crisis management, building security and defense capacities, and protecting the EU itself. This is important to make this distinction, because crisis management is an operational concept, including both civilian and military action. Security and defense capacities include a lot of work also on the issues that are and the capacities which are relevant for territorial defense. And protecting the EU itself, of course, involves a cross-pillar, what would in the past be called a cross-pillar approach in supporting internal security in the EU, And of course there is an internal security strategy for the EU as well. Looking at the operational capabilities, we don't see a lot. Basically, it's not a very impressive figure to say that you have 4,000 people deployed worldwide. Already the OSCE has over 2,000 deployed in its missions inside the OSCE area of applications. And the UN is of course much, much bigger. So that's not the big thing here. There are a number of other things which are more important for interoperability and getting the EU action together generally, which we'll come back to in this podcast. There is more coherent staff work going on. There is permanent structured cooperation developed, which is focusing on defense investment, cooperation and operational readiness among and there are already 25 participating member states here. There is a European Defence Fund supposed to create real financial incentives for systematic defense industrial cooperation in research and capability development. And I personally believe that this is a quite important development, since the fragmentation of resources in the EU on defense, various tanks and artillery pieces and so on are duplicated, and anything that can be done in order to reduce fragmentation here will clearly bring much more effectiveness from the perspective of the taxpayer. Then there is a European peace facility which should fund the common costs of defense operations and contribute to the financing of military peace support operations. This is also very important. Started with the African peace facilities many years back, but has now been broadened to become a more generic financial fund. As an example, they put in here the fact that in terms of operations, we are now down from 176 attacks in pirate attacks outside the Horn of Africa in 2011, just down to 4 and failed attacks in 2018. Of course, one can argue to what extent this is a result of EU action. This is a global cooperative endeavor, and also what private security firms are doing on board ships is of course clearly very, very important. Then you have the operation of Sophia in the Mediterranean, which deals with migrant smugglers and human traffickers. It's an interesting and important operation from many perspectives, since the question has been raised to what extent this operation helps to project the image of the European Union as a humanitarian actor that you would wish to see. Then we have the even more problematic relationship, of course, with Libya and its navy and coast guard, which is probably infiltrated to a certain extent by those who also promote smuggling and human trafficking. So this is not a simple, the evaluation of our missions, the EU missions, is not a simple matter and needs a careful and critical approach. And this is clearly one central issue coming up for the coming years, to what extent international operations developed by the EU itself or in cooperation with NATO will help, whether securitization of certain humanitarian development and other problems in the southern neighborhood and eastern neighborhood, to what extent that should be met through international military operations. So that's one problematic area which is not very much discussed in the strategy itself, but clearly needs to be discussed, and one would wish to see more careful and critical evaluation documents coming up on this point in the coming year or so, before new strategies are further developed. Another focus has been on hybrid threats, clearly a very interesting area for where the EU has considerable comparative advantage, given the fact that there is such a broad and differentiated cooperation in many technical areas among EU member states. There is also the cooperation between EU and NATO, which is underpinning this. Joint work on military mobility is another case in point where you can help to bring the resources of the civilian society in support of, for instance, making it possible to transport military vehicles on roads, etc. You have the issue of cyber and maritime security, all areas where the EU as a whole has important comparative advantage. Intelligence support to decision making, as mentioned. Interoperability is of course a key issue, strengthening also the capabilities of territorial defense in Europe. There is a recognition that member states have only a single set of forces that they use in different contexts, be it in NATO, be it in the EU, be it in support of the United Nations or the OSCE. And then the reference to the European Defence and Technological Industrial Base is also important. This is what one would have called in the past a cross-pillar issue in the EU, where the Commission has a very important role. Technology and cyber, yet another area where the EU has a strong comparative advantage. In this context, there is a table showing 34 new defense cooperation projects, including, for instance, cooperation on drones, on disaster relief capability, on maritime surveillance, and cyber, etc., etc. And then another table which illustrates what I just said about military mobility, which deals, for instance, with infrastructure not suitable for the weight or size of military assets, which is a useful mapping of roads, etc., and bridges and others, forms for infrastructure, where the EU, of course, has a very, very important comparative advantage, giving its transport networks. There is a discussion of financial support for dual-use civilian military infrastructure projects, which is also has a significant funding for the coming years, as proposed, 6.5 billion euros. Let's see how much is actually approved. The expediting cross-border movement permissions is an issue which I myself was involved with already from the beginning of the year 2000. When we were discussing how to make it possible for countries to move different types of equipments and personnel across borders, which used already in those years to be a quite bureaucratic and difficult exercise. The next chapter of the review of the global strategy deals with global governance and cooperative regional orders, for promoting and strengthening multilateralism, the fact that the EU has stepped up its funding support for the UN system, focusing on climate change, sustainable development agenda 2030, etc. Deepening multilateralism also has an important dimension in the political and trade agreements that the EU is trying to pursue with lots of disappointments, but also progress with Mercosur, Mexico, Chile, Australia, New Zealand, Canada and Japan, etc. Finding a way to promote partnership approaches in the area of migrations and refugees, on ocean governance, impact for environment, also working on human rights together with other countries and regions has been important. The progress in cooperation with NATO has been significant, whereas the cooperation with the United States, of course, has to be described in more moderate terms, to say the least, where the scope for cooperation with the United States has become significantly limited in the last years. There is a specific mention of the Western Balkans. Now one can say that there is a little bit more energy and optimism into the enlargement approach on the Western Balkans, seeing the Western Balkans country as an integral part of the EU's own regional space. This is not an easy issue. It deals not just with the problem of North Macedonia, the problem of how one can integrate for Albania, but also, of course, what will happen with Serbia, and even more difficult with Bosnia, and solving the issue with Kosovo. Member states are, as illustrated by the last Foreign Affairs meeting in Brussels, still hesitant to move very quickly forward in these areas. There is also a reference to the Middle East and North Africa and EU partnerships with regional organizations. The Eastern Partnership, mentioning the association agreements with Georgia, Moldova and Ukraine. And we have the problem of Turkey, of course, which is described in rather neutral terms, talking about the successful cooperation. Behind that, of course, is the important migration deal, but there are also many disappointments in this area. And even if there is a high-level political dialogue, there are, of course, significant divergences of views, which are also affecting cooperation inside NATO. The development of the EU-African partnership is also important, which includes a number of sub-regional cooperative endeavors. References to support to the peace process in Afghanistan is given a special table. Again, behind this table is, of course, a very much more problematic situation in Afghanistan again. There is a reference and a table on the contact group on Venezuela as a good case in point of coming together on a specific problematic situation. References to EU partnership with Asia, Latin America, post-Cotonou agreements, and Russia, Arctic. What strikes there is the absence of a very significant effort in support of a coordinated approach in the EU relationship to China, which already in early years was a sticky point in the discussion about the European Union strategic priorities. A summary analysis of what more can be done. 4 strands of action are mentioned: reform multilateralism with different groups of countries in different contexts, different constellations, like in the climate agreement in Paris in 2015, changing somewhat later. There are cyber dialogues, technological panels, regional dialogues, for and with youth, etc. A regional multilateralism approach is also there, working with the African Union, ASEAN, etc. Smart multilateralism is also mentioned. The European Union, UN, African Union trilateral partnership is also mentioned in a specific table. And then, of course, the issue of intra-EU coordination of multilateralism is key, has to do with how the EU works in international organizations, where, of course, very significant progress has taken place in the 20-25 years in which I have participated and observed developments from a very limited cooperation on the most sort of intergovernmental issues in the EU, led by a rotating EU presidency, towards a situation where the EU as institutions speak on behalf of the European Union in many, many different multilateral contexts. The issue of resilience is that's a concept that has dominated the approach to not least the southern dimension in the EU global strategy and the follow-up action plans, combined with what was previously called the comprehensive approach to security, now called the integrated approach, based on regional strategies, focusing on strengthening the resilience of states and societies. And this, of course, is related to the issue of fragility and conflict. And the notion of principled pragmatism is something which was developed by the current High Representative as a notion which should bring some modesty and pragmatism into the approach, which by many has been interpreted to mean that one must and should also cooperate with countries which do not uphold all the principles and values that form the core of EU cooperation. This does not, as noted here, mean supporting stability by condoning authoritarianism. State and societal resilience can only go hand in hand. This also involves fighting violent extremism, terrorism, strategic communication and civil society support. Here is an important discourse, of course, to what extent one would like to securitize many of these issues, how terrorism best can be tackled. An important, I would say, table on the integrated approach in the Sahel, where there has been a Sahel strategy. These are the countries to the south of the Maghreb countries, Mauritania, Mali, Niger and Chad, an enormous area. Of course, Mali is already the size of Spain and France together. And there has been a long period of development of a coherent approach to this, including political partnership, security and stability support, development cooperation, including 8 billion euros over the last 5-year period. So that's a very important concrete example. The integrated approach was focused, as it developed under the previous High Representative, under the name of the comprehensive approach, was focusing on the security development nexus, but has been moved beyond that by developing a holistic approach to conflicts, bearing in mind that their identity, humanitarian, socioeconomic, security, environmental and energy dimensions need to be taken into account. And there is need to look at it from over time, looking at the preventive phase, the crisis management phase and the peace-building phases. This is a very, very important issue, which of course ideally should focus both on lessons learned and looking forward into the proposed end state far into the future, and where the EU still has a lot of work to do, as do all international institutions, in being honest with itself about what it has done and what it can do for the future, and what are the important measurements of success. The conflict prevention discourse is still alive and kicking, a very important concept which was developed in the EU and used in the EU, as it was in the OSCE and the UN from the late 90s. Making full use of the EU toolbox is something which has developed considerably over the years, and of course includes many dimensions from mediation and so on. And here clearly the mobilization of the gender dimension of EU work is clearly very, very important. We have moved from a perspective of discussing the role of women, children and elderly as objects, as victims of conflicts, to an approach of mobilizing everyone into solving and dealing with the challenges facing the EU. A very ambitious approach for the future, proposing an increase of 30 billion to devote to foreign policy and defense, something which is being analyzed very critically by member states. There is a proposed single neighborhood development and international cooperation instruments, so ever more generic geographic instruments, thematic instruments, rather than the fragmented picture that was provided in the past. This is not only unproblematic and good, it's also a question where you constantly have to discuss to what extent specific needs, for instance mine action and so on, small arms and other things like that, are forgotten in this overall huge frameworks. An important table in the document shows how the EU works with countering disinformation, with different key pillars of the action plan. There is another joined up approach analysis of the humanitarian development peace nexus, the internal-external nexus, and the cooperation inside the EU and inside the European Commission with the Commissioners' Group on External Action. So the different ways to get the EU action together. There is a very important table on migration partnership, going all the way from addressing root causes to returning migrants to their home through the EU-IOM joint initiative. Another joined-up approach is on the economic political security nexus. There is a climate and security nexus, so there are different ways to bring the EU together, including, of course, promoting member state coordination in practice. So, in summary, the EU global strategy and the High Representative puts the suggestion that the EU in the years ahead can advance the security of the Union by deepening its work on intelligence, strategic culture, interoperability, command and control, defense cooperation, technology and cyber, civil and military CSDP, and access to routes and networks. This is of course, a very, very ambitious program, but the potential should not be underestimated. Another vector proposed for action is to promote and protect multilateralism, support regional cooperative orders. A third is to continue to work on the resilience of states. And the fourth is to develop further the political and financial investment in external action. And then finally, almost finally, we come to the notion of autonomy, which is a central concept for many of the member states, such as France, focusing on the notion that a more autonomous EU is one which is more able to act together with its partners wherever possible, but alone when necessary. And then in the annex of the document, there are a number of tables which give a lot of important illustrations. The single command center for EU military missions, an overview of actual European Union CSDP missions and operations in 2019, a table on the Permanent Structured Cooperation, PESCO, a table on the European Defence Fund and European Peace Facility, a table on the Coordinated Annual Review on Defence, a table on the new Civilian Compact covering the 2,000 staff currently serving in 10 EU civilian missions, a table describing what has been achieved in cooperation between EU and NATO, a table on how to counter hybrid and cyber threats and what the EU has done in the period on this, a table on state and societal resilience, taking the example of the Western Balkans on its road to the EU path, with significant statistics to underpin this notion. The EU External Investment Plan is another table, particularly focusing on Africa. Linking humanitarian aid and development, combining emergency humanitarian aid and long-term development cooperation, using the example of Yemen. Support to climate resilience, 20 billion EU and member states investment just in 2017 in public climate finance. And deepening relations with youth and civil society, supporting human rights defenders, for instance. Integrated approach to conflicts and crises, with examples from Ukraine, 14 billion support package. Integrated approach to the Sahel, with the 2.3 million people in the region benefiting from EU actions. Support to the Colombia peace process, long-term engagement with Iraq, EU response to the Syrian conflict with 6.2 billion euros, and a summary of what the EU has done in the Syrian crisis, including support to Lebanon, support to Turkey, support in Jordan. Cooperative regional orders, the Eastern Partnership, and partnership with Africa, regional cooperation in the Middle East and North Africa, a strategic approach to Asia, a more integrated Central Asia. There is a new strategy out there, investing in friendship with Latin America, with lots of statistics, and of course the global governance for the 21st century with EU support to the United Nations, focusing on what the Swedish Commission has been doing, Cecilia Malmström, the new generation of trade and political agreements, EU-Canada agreement, EU-Japan agreement. Altogether 72 trade agreements in force. The Iran deal, of course, a problematic process, are now very much under attack. And the climate deal, Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda. Digital diplomacy, and having an internal-external nexus on migration, looking at the EU Trust Fund for Africa, strategic communications in foreign policy, strengthening areas of cooperation on counterterrorism, economic and cultural diplomacy, and looking at developing a smarter budget for EU foreign policy. And here, of course, there are significant numbers. Neighborhood policy proposed 22 billion for the coming period, 32 billion for sub-Saharan Africa, 10 billion for Asian Pacific, 4 billion for Americas and Caribbean, 500 million for overseas countries and territories including Greenland, and for the enlargement pre-accession assistance 14.5 billion euros. Let's see how much of this is actually approved by EU member states. Again, the notion is to merge most foreign policy funding instruments into one single instrument, and a proposal to increase the overall external action budget to 123 billion euros for the period 21 to 27. So that's the end of this podcast. Again, what strikes me is the absence of systematic references to the role of partners such as China. The notion that the EU had a number of strategic partners, which was very prominent in earlier documents in the beginning of the decade, is now almost gone. So I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Clearly it will be easier to follow on the YouTube version, but there will be more on this, particularly as we continue to discuss in Sweden also the development of our own national security strategy. Thank you for listening. You are listening to an e-learning light podcast produced by Lars-Erik Lundin for Lundin och Bäcklund AB. Copyright on and around the topic of Europe and security. Please do subscribe on the Lars-Erik Lundin channels on SoundCloud or YouTube. Thank you. Also, do visit the ellilundin.org website and follow on @Londil on Twitter.